Is the author being anti-Semitic when she brings up the book, My Gender Workbook by Kate Bornstein? Listen to this. So the author writes, the second, My Gender Workbook, How to Become a Real Man, a Real Woman, the Real You, or something else entirely. This book isn't for professionals. It's an activist tract recruiting kids. The cover resembles a grade school workbook and features a doll that's half Ken and half Barbie. The author is Kate Bornstein, who explains he was born Albert, but as an adult, quote, became a woman, end quote, for a few years, then, quote, stopped being a woman and settled into being neither, end quote. What's up, everybody? It's Chicago talk show host, and I'm here to review Lost in Trans Nation, the Child Psychiatrist's Guide Out of the Madness, written by Dr. Miriam Grossman. So what I'm going to do is start off with a couple of opening thoughts, and then I'm going to get into a couple of passages that I liked from each chapter, with the exception of one chapter, chapter 13, and from there on, encourage you to kind of make up your own decisions, as always, and draw your own conclusions, and get the book for yourself and see what you think of it. So, a couple of opening thoughts. You know, as I read this book, I couldn't help but notice that the author doesn't explicitly showcase her support for homosexuality or her approval, but doesn't seem to outwardly condemn it. And so there's that. But at the same time, she has plenty to say about the trans agenda and its moral implications, right? So she has plenty to say about that. Doesn't have a whole lot to say about homosexuality and what that means and its implications there. And I think there's a double standard there that I just couldn't overlook. To me, that's like saying, you know, I condemn raping people, right? But at the same time, I approve of other forms of violence. You know, it's incoherent and inconsistent. It should be all forms of violence is inherently wrong, right? Not just rape. And so I wish she was more bold in taking a stand. If you're going to take a stand over trying to say what's morally right and what's truthful, I think you need to go the whole way instead of some of the way. And then the second thing that really kind of rubbed me the wrong way was she brings up the Talmud towards the end of the book. So the Talmud, in case you don't know, it's this Jewish text, and to say that it's controversial is putting it lightly. You know, there's a lot of themes, but they really they revolve around central themes like truth, the idea of good versus evil, right from wrong, right? These are moral, and honestly, they're already encroaching and getting into the theological, because this is where we derive these things, right? And you know, it's interesting to me that I think the author, I think she's knocking on the doorstep of converting to Catholicism, and if not, I think it would behoove the author to seriously consider it. So, beginning with the foreword, there's a foreword here by Dr. Jordan Peterson, and on the one hand, I highly respect his insight, his intelligence, and the ferocity of his reason. And here's a good example of it, and we're going to get right into it right away. And he writes, again, this is the foreword: why did this happen? Why indeed? And why have we failed to learn? To begin with, there is no reason to assume that physicians, ETAL, would be particularly less prone than any other class of persons to fall prey to the blandishments of demented ideologues, and there is some evidence to suggest that they may in fact be more rather than less likely to participate in the perpetration of political and other forms of horror. Medical personnel have access to vulnerable people at the points in their life when that vulnerability is most magnified. This can create opportunities for those characterized by the darkest of personality traits. Surgeons and anesthesiologists, in particular, may exhibit higher levels of narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and sadism than those typifying the general population. These traits, collectively referred to as the dark tetrad, are characterized by callous disregard for others, manipulative behavior, desire for power and control, and a positive delight in the subjugation and suffering of others. This all creates a very toxic brew, psychological and political, with regard to victim and perpetrator, and one whose analysis sheds substantive light on the newest set of transmissible diseases plaguing our current culture. There has been a substantive increase in the number of young people presented with so-called gender dysphoria in recent years. This has been caused, in all likelihood, by the same mechanisms operative when other psychogenic epidemics have spread through the population. That is, by the marshalling of social forces, for oft political reasons, to shape the manifestation of an underlying non-specific proclivity to anxiety, depression, and hopelessness among a vulnerable subset of children and adolescents. This marshalling is done under the rubric of hypothetical, quote, compassion, end quote, for young people suffering through the increased self-consciousness and negative emotion commonly associated with puberty, parentheses, particularly among girls, particularly if they reach puberty earlier, end parentheses, end quote. So it's stuff like that that I really laud Dr. Jordan Peterson's refreshing logic and piercing wisdom as an expert in his field. But then he just takes it in another direction, ironically, when he's speaking about the political element about this trans agenda, and he brings up the Holocaust. So he writes, medical professionals played key roles in the genocide of Jews and other minorities during the Holocaust. So what does the Holocaust have to do with the trans agenda? Right? We're reminded ad nauseum of this narrative and this event, right? And we're constantly slammed on the head to remember this sort of thing, but we can't talk about its details. But here we are, and here's Jordan Peterson telling us and reminding us about the Holocaust in his foreword about a book on the trans agenda.
You know.
It's scary.
And that is the truth. And nobody died in the Holocaust either.
No.
That's the truth.
Yeah.
So the next part of the book that I want to talk about is, there's a section called A Note on Language. And that's interesting, right? So the author went out of her way to dedicate a subchapter on language. And that's important because it was important enough for the author to realize that there's something going on with language revolving these agendas, right? And there's something that's off about it, enough where it warranted its own little subchapter. And the author writes, at the start of this project, I had to decide whether to comply with my profession and use a newly mandated vocabulary. Keyword there is mandated. She goes on, to me it's a language without clarity. Even the word gender has no coherent definition. To say nothing of non-binary and cisgender, I was also aware that the newly invented terms erase an ancient one, woman. If a man can be a woman, then woman means nothing. She goes on. But times have changed. We face a crusade, a juggernaut that seeks to demolish male and female, and its success hinges on the control of language. Under those circumstances, to call a man she is not a kindness, it's a concession. To scheme to control our beliefs and advance an agenda, one pronoun at a time. She writes, in this book, I emphasize that male and female, after being established at conception, are permanent. I urge parents to be honest and consistent with their children and to at all times stay grounded in biological reality. She writes, could I write she while quietly holding on to my truth? I could, but that presents a few problems. One, it's living a lie, and that injures the soul. Two, co-opting the word woman is offensive to me. I am not a belief or a costume. So those are some pretty smart words from the author, right? But conspicuously absent is the divine component to language. This is why the author feels off about this language, this political language, right, being used, oriented around these agendas, because they're false. They mean nothing. And going back to the idea of the divinity in language, it's because you have to look no further than the Bible, the book of Genesis, the first sentence where it says, in the beginning, there was the Word. There's no escaping that language is deeply tied to logos, which is the word, right? And this is why the attempt to co-opt language and try to capture it and turn it into something that it is not, will not work. It's irrational, and there's something satanic about that process. Here, I'm going to give you some more insight. Let's look into a man you maybe heard of, Thomas Aquinas. He wrote a book called On Being and Essence. All right? So, in the introduction of this book, which is titled Introduction on Being and Essence, it's noted, since the meaning of a word, which is a sign of reality, engages us with reality itself, it cannot be understood without grasping reality. Stop the video, rewind it, and listen to that once again. The fundamental understanding of this is that language itself is based on reality. So when it's not based on reality, language doesn't make sense, right? Because we're talking about nothing, right? And so there you go. This is also a quick read, and I highly recommend that you do read it. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do a quick book review on this as well. You know, and I will go on to say that there's a certain perversion happening with language, right? When you use these sort of neologisms that don't mean anything, and you try to make them mean something by creating its own reality, a made-up reality, which is not in line with ultimate reality, because there's only one true reality, and that's ultimate reality, right? That there are two sexes, and that God created us, right? And so when you deviate from that, now you're in this narcissistic and arrogant path, this prideful path of thinking that you can subject your will over nature, and you're gonna run into problems with that. So going into the introduction, you know, the author does a really good job of continuing to skate by the themes of good versus evil, because this is what's really going on, right? And she continues to do that throughout the book until way later on in the book, where she finally talks about God briefly. So here's an example in the introduction. The author writes, I want the following truths recognized by everyone on the planet aside from gender studies professors and grad students until about 2 weeks ago, to be acknowledged in the first pages of this book. Sex is not assigned at birth. It's established at conception. Brains always match the bodies to which they are attached. We are not Legos or Mr. Potato Heads that might be improperly assembled. Sex is binary. Sex is permanent. Males cannot become females, and females cannot become males. She writes, "For me, this is a black and white issue. Most things in life are nuanced, but this is not one of them. This is," and here's a word you don't expect from a doctor, "evil." It's evil to indoctrinate children and young adults with falsehood and to drive a wedge between them and their loving parents. It's evil to encourage them on a path that leads to harm. And it's evil to describe it all as a journey to authenticity and to entice children with glitter and rainbows. So to me, this goes back to the idea of tiptoeing around morality. And I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can say that you're pro-humanity, but at the same time be pro-choice, right? I think it's one or the other. I don't think you can get away with the double standard of celebrating or promoting or advocating for one deviant form of behavior, but at the same time say no, not like that, and goes and say no, that's going too far in terms of deviant behavior, because at the end of the day, it's all deviant behavior. Or trying to, again, put your will over nature and think that you're better than nature and do what you will, right? These are very satanic ways of thinking. It's like,
oh yeah, you don't have to follow the rules. You can just do whatever you want.
But then what ends up happening is you're condemned to follow through the next progression of deviance. So it's like, okay, you accept deviant form of behavior 1. Now deviant form of behavior, which is worse than the first one, number 2 is coming up. And you have to accept it, because if you don't accept it, then that means you don't accept deviant behavior number 1. And what are you, a bigot? And so this is a satanic condemnation to continue to go down and go towards even worse deviance and worse depravity, worse levels of degeneracy. And ultimately, it's so that way Satan and his demons can make fun of you and embarrass you as a human being, a being that was made in the image of God. And he laughs every time that he corrupts you. So there you go. Furthermore, in the introduction, Dr. Miriam Grossman, she writes, "I'll explain that transgender ideology is a system of beliefs, like a religion. It has a unique language and articles of faith. While the language and beliefs are bizarre, they are taught as sacred facts. The core belief that biology can and should be denied is a repudiation of reality." So what does the author mean by that? What are we talking about here? The repudiation of reality. There's only one reality. You're living in it, I'm living in it. Now, that being said, there are narcissistic people who are evil and, again, arrogant and prideful, who want to make their will over reality, right? And so what ends up happening is, what are we really talking about here? It's a repudiation of reality, aka a repudiation of the moral law of nature, of what nature intended, why we have different sex organs, and how we reproduce naturally. So to go against that, what we're really talking about is to go against nature, right? I keep saying, if you respect and love nature so much, stop going against it. What we're really getting at, though, is going against what God intended. And at the heart of this is why the whole thing is deeply satanic. The last note I'll make in the introduction is at some point the word revolution comes up. And the context that I want you to understand for moderns, when they're talking about revolution and they're talking about liberating you, understand that these are terms that are meant to placate the lost, the aimless, who are ready to be swept up by whatever ideological or propaganda machine or movement is happening. Because what we're really talking about is revolution to, again, what is a revolution towards? Against the moral law, against nature. That's what the revolution is. Who's the biggest revolutionary of all time? It wasn't Hitler, it was Satan. And when the modern says that they want to liberate you, oh yeah, you know, you don't have to be a mom and raise kids. We're going to liberate you from all that. Wait, what are you talking about? What do you have in store for me then? So you can spend your youth, your childbearing years, working at a job that does not care about you and is ready to replace you? For what? So you can get the almighty dollar and get a bunch of material things that won't make you happy? To replace having children with cats and dogs that are not the same as having children? That's your liberation? Give me a break. What they mean by that is enslavement. So in the first chapter we learn about John Money. And so controversial figure to say the least, and who warped and took us down a negative path in history since then. And so you get to learn about him in case you don't know about him already. Here's a brief description from the author. John Money changed that, she writes. He proposed the existence of a psychological sex separate and more consequential than the body's sex. He named the psychological sex, quote, gender, end quote. So here we have John Money, this revolutionary figure, right? There's that key word to understand. And let's learn a little bit about him. What was his upbringing like? Dr. Miriam Grossman tells us, she writes, John had a traumatic childhood. He was a thin, delicate boy who was bullied at school. His father, who was prone to explosive acts of violence, terrorized his mother and abused John. In later life, Money described his father as a brutal man who shot the birds in his fruit garden and whipped 4-year-old John over a broken window. It was that incident, Money wrote, that helped establish his lifelong rejection of, quote, the brutality of manhood, end quote. Full stop. So here we have this figure in history who's going to promote this warped and reverse idea into the mainstream American conscious. He makes his entire judgment on man off of his awful father. Think about that. That doesn't make any sense. Yes, there are bad people in this world, male and female. It's a part of reality and it's a part of existence because man is fundamentally prone to being corrupt, right? But does that mean that you condemn all of men? No. If there's one female bad apple out there, are you going to condemn all of all females to be responsible? No, that doesn't make any sense. But here we are. So this is a very troubled individual, and I feel sorry for him for that having to go through that. But you made a big mistake by thinking that all men are like that, because we're not. Clearly. I digress. The author writes, John was 8 when his father died, after which he was raised by his mother and unmarried aunts in a strictly religious home. Full stop again. Time and again, studies have shown that the the that it's best to raise a child with a male and female, a mother and a father, right? That dynamic, the nuclear household dynamic. Now, that's not to say that a single mom can't raise a child, or a single father can't raise a child. They can do it, but will it be the same as a stable relationship of a mother and father raising that child? It doesn't come close, right? And that's for any deviance to the nuclear household. And so the information is out there, and so that's something for you to kind of research on your own. But I don't think that helped his case. Being this troubled youth, this boy, and you're being raised, I mean, it's better than nothing, but you're being raised by your mom and then a bunch of other women, aunts. So there's no, guess what's missing? A positive, healthy male role model. Someone who says, here's what you do. You're becoming a young man. Here's what you do in these situations, right? And you need someone there, not just to be a man and be like, well, I'm going to give money to the situation, and at least it's, I'm providing money. You actually have to be there as a father and attend to your child's need. It's not just throwing money at it and say, here's a roof over your head. No, you have to care about his studies. You have to care about his issues and him growing up. You have to actually be there as a father to help your son go through life and help him and show him what it means to be a good man in this world. Because if not, who's going to do that? Who's going to do it?
Come on, man.
Rightfully so, the author agrees. She writes, it's fair to wonder if the absence of a positive male role model during John's early life and repression of his sexuality by his religious mother and aunts contributed to what would today be called his, quote, gender dysphoria, end quote, rejection of his male genitals. So this is from John Money. This is what John Money says. He says, I suffered from the guilt of being male, he wrote. Quote, I wrote the mark of a man's vile sexuality. I wondered if the world might really be a better place for women if not only farm animals, but human males also gelded at birth. So this is somebody, end quote. So this is somebody who has had such a negative experience growing up with his awful father that not only does he blame him as a representative for all males as far as the injustices he endured, but he also goes another step forward and just says,
Hey, we should just castrate males in general.
I mean, the psychopathy is unreal. It's unchecked. And it's, again, because this kid didn't have a positive male role model to say, no, dude, you need to chill out. Why don't you start eating right? Why don't you start working out? Why don't you get a job? And why don't you help out your family and your local community in some way and see what happens? But no, instead, there's a lack of, there's a youth naivete at play and a horrid understanding of the world because you haven't been exposed to it. And so you right away reach for hateful extremes, condemn all of manhood, and next thing you know, let's castrate all the men. How about this? Why
Don't just kill all men, right? Let's just
solve the world's problems that way? I mean, this is the kind of diabolical thinking that ends up being spawned out of these dark, traumatic experiences that aren't alleviated by someone who's able to remedy them by healthy forms of truth and healthy examples and showing them better ways to cope with this sort of thing. So we're in the second chapter. Here's a passage that stood out to me. The author writes, in my quest to understand the bizarre evolution of gender identity, I discovered the process would require studying post-structuralism, first-wave feminism, queer theory, gender schema theory, second-wave feminism, Marxist feminism, anti-essentialism, radical feminism, third-wave feminism, and radical gender theory. Whew, that's an awful lot of feminism to consider. So what does the author do in regards to these big name things, particularly the role of Marxism feminism, right? Marxism, Karl Marx, this figure in history that was prominent in the form of communism, right? We hear about Nazis and National Socialism all day, but much less so about what happened with the Bolsheviks in Russia and the Russian Revolution, right? And communism, just more blood-drenched history, and Vladimir Lenin. You may hear like in certain pop culture that like there are figures fighting the power, but no, that's not true. Understand that there's blood-soaked history associated with communism, as well as outright evil, and it's still here today. So what does the author do when she brings up these things that demand attention? Now, rightfully so, she puts down in the introduction that she's going to bring up some topics, some subtopics, like these, and that she could talk about them, but for the purposes of the book, she's gonna just mention them, but not go into too details in them, because it's gonna make the book way more complicated, right? And this is what we have here. She writes, "That's not gonna happen. I'm not going to pretend I even know what any of those are." I'm going to reread that. I'm not going to pretend I even know what any of those are. So personally, I don't understand that phrase of that statement. Are you saying you do understand, but you don't want to pretend that you understand, or that you don't understand and you want to pretend that you do understand? There's a vacuum there. There's a vacuum of some very serious things that roles of, we'll just say feminism, right? We'll keep it simple, that has to do in the undermining of traditional values and society that has clearly had negative and detrimental effects on society since its revolutionary introductions from back in the 60s and 70s and even before that. Then why are we celebrating feminism still? Clearly, there's more going on, and clearly these are tools of social engineering that have had negative consequences since their implementation. Think about that. All right, so here's a question. Is the author being anti-Semitic when she brings up the book, My Gender Workbook by Kate Bornstein? Listen to this. So the author writes, "The second, My Gender Workbook, How to Become a Real Man, a Real Woman, the Real You, or something else entirely. This book isn't for professionals. It's an activist tract recruiting kids. The cover resembles a grade school workbook and features a doll that's half Ken and half Barbie. The author is Kate Bornstein, who explains he was born Albert, but as an adult, quote, became a woman, end quote, for a few years, then, quote, stopped being a woman and settled into being neither, end quote." So there you go. I mean, do what you want with that, but the question is real. Is the author being anti-Semitic for bringing up this book? What's going on here? And there's an awful lot of assurances that these people know what a woman is and what a man is But then when you try to ask a modern, what is a woman, they give you all this neologism, ideological ridden vomit that they hear from places where they get indoctrinated and all this propaganda on social media.
And female.
Through my training, in healthcare, there are several different
categories for how we define sex. People bring up chromosomes. People also bring up hormone levels. People bring up all sorts of other categories. Lots of people don't fit neatly into a gender binary, even people we don't consider to be intersex.
It's incoherent and inconsistent. It just goes in circles like, oh, a woman is a woman, duh. So I made a video on this, by the way, on this subject. I did my own response on what is a woman, so make sure you check that out and let me know your thoughts. So moving on to chapter 3, I'm going to omit a word because YouTube has its algorithms and it's really quick to shut videos down. And so I'll say blank and you can fill in the blank when I say it in regards to what the author is talking about. And it shouldn't take too much of brain power to figure out what the blank word is. So chapter 3, this was a section that stood out to me. The author writes, 2 events preceded Rosa's quote, non-binary, unquote, identity. Her mother told me. A boy she loved dumped her and blank lockdowns. Rosa was a gifted 15-year-old from San Diego who'd until recently been a compliant and easy child. She had always been anxious, especially in social situations. Her mother saw her as naive and easily manipulated. I feel like there's many such cases of that sort of thing, right? The author writes, with high school's daunting social scene ahead of her, Rosa's anxiety peaked the summer before 9th grade. But the first week of school, she met Sean in AP English and fell for him at once. They went out all year, and she truly thought he was the one. Rosa wore a sexy gown to prom and thoroughly enjoyed the glitz and glamour. That summer, she and Sean spent their free time surfing. But on Thanksgiving, he suddenly broke up with her, and she cried for a month. With blank lockdowns, Rosa was separated from her friends. She discovered a new group online, and during every free moment was talking, texting, and FaceTiming. That's when her transformation began. So there's plenty of information out there about the evolving, detrimental, and worldwide effects of these lockdowns. And it's staggering. But you go out there and you make your own conclusions. Chapter 4 is a really great chapter. They're all really good. But here we see a lot of the author's intelligence and her professional expertise shine. So here's a segment that really stood out to me. Dr. Miriam Grossman writes, affirming care proponents propose the striking rise of gender dysphoria is due to society's increasing acceptance. There were always this many trans people. They just never had the words to express themselves or faith that society would accept them. She continues, as psychology professor Philip Hammock put it to the New York Times, the spike in trans-identifying teenagers, quote, signifies a new confidence among a new generation to be authentic in their gender identity, end quote. The Times wasn't sure, quote, whether that jump, brackets, in the number of those identifying as trans, end brackets, reflects inaccuracies in the previous estimate, a true increase in the number of transgender adolescents, or both, end quote. That's the bewildering question of why all this is happening, Dr. Jody Herman added in. The author writes, Dr. Herman, are you unaware of Lisa Littman's paper and her robust evidence for social contagion as a contributing factor to adolescent gender dysphoria? Or are you simply dismissing her critical contribution? The author continues. If the rise in gender dysphoria is due to social acceptance, where are the hordes of eagerly newly identified trans, non-binary, gender fluid adults in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s? Why do we see only teens and young adults coming out with their friends after binging on social media? She continues, let's say for argument's sake that the soaring rates among youth are due to increasing social acceptance. How then do we explain the alarming rates of mental health issues in youth of, quote, diverse, end quote, gender identities? She continues, now here's an interesting spin. Their emotional problems are due to society's transphobia. Yup, that's what we're supposed to believe. The rates of transgender identifying teens have skyrocketed because society is more accepting, but those same people who are more accepted suffer from anxiety, depression, and increased suicidality because ... there's so much transphobia. This is intellectually dishonest. It's one or the other. You can't have it both ways. Go ahead and smash the like button and subscribe to my channel if you're enjoying this book review so far. But otherwise, we're going to keep going. So chapter 5, this segment called The Whistleblower. So we learn about A1 Jamie Reed, who is the whistleblower. And we get some insight into who she is and kind of what's happening here. So the author writes, she starts off with a quote from Jamie Reed. And this is a quote from Jamie Reed that the paragraph starts in. Quote, I took the job because I support trans rights and firmly believed I would be able to provide good care for children at the center who are appropriate candidates to be receiving medical transition. End quote, Reed wrote. Quote, the center's working assumption was that the earlier you treat kids with gender dysphoria, the more anguish you can prevent later on. This premise was shared by the center's doctors and therapists. Given their expertise, I assumed that abundant evidence backed this consensus. End quote. So the author points out that from 2018 to 2022, Reed worked as a case manager at the Washington University Pediatric Transgender Center at St. Louis Children's Hospital, where she was responsible for patient intake and oversight, end quote. So there's some information about who this person is. And the author continues. She assumed wrong. The abundant evidence didn't exist. There were no formal protocols for treatments at the clinic, and the physician co-directors were the sole authorities. The care she witnessed profoundly troubled her. Interesting. But here's where it gets more interesting. The author writes, Reed self-describes as a, quote, a queer woman and politically to the left of Bernie Sanders, ... now married to a trans man, end quote. Yet in January 2023, this progressive, tattooed, pro-trans woman hired a pro-family Christian lawyer and provided sworn testimony to the suit-wearing, conservative, Republican Attorney General of Red State, Missouri. That is interesting. So in this chapter, you see a plethora of issues. And I won't get too much into detail. I'm here in this book review. That's for you to enjoy and read in this book. But here's a little preface. The author writes, or here's a little preview. Reed saw a parade of malpractice and deception inflicted on vulnerable children and their parents that she called nothing less than, quote, morally and medically appalling, end quote. Those are some strong words. What are we talking about when we say words like deception? We're talking about lies. So we're talking about people, these authority figures, and the science community lying to children and their parents. Shocking. But fortunately for you, as doing this book review, and we're getting into chapter 6, and I'm gonna share with you a couple of insights on what Reed saw, and some of these passages that really stood out to me. So buckle up or buckle in, and we'll get into it. The author writes, Reed continued, doctors know that cross-sex hormones, parentheses, immediately after puberty blockers, end parentheses, make children permanently sterile. The doctors did not share this information with parents or children. Another disturbing aspect of the center was its lack of regard for the rights of parents and the extent to which doctors saw themselves as more informed decision makers over the fate of these children. The center downplayed the negative consequences and emphasized the need for transition. As the center's website said, quote, left untreated, gender dysphoria has any number of consequences from self-harm to suicide. But when you take away the gender dysphoria by allowing a child to be he or she is, we're noticing that goes away. The studies we have showed these kids often wind up functionally, psychosocially as well or better than their peers, end quote. Reed says, there are no reliable studies showing this. Indeed, the experiences of many of the center's patients prove how false these assertions are. Brackets, yet, end brackets. A common tactic was for doctors to tell the parent of a child assigned female at birth, you can either have a living son or a dead daughter, end quote. The clinicians would tell parents of a child assigned male at birth, you can either have a living daughter or a dead son, end quote. That introduced the idea of suicide to the children. The suicide assertion was also based on false statistics. The clinicians would also malign any parent that was not on board with the medicalizing their children. They would speak disparaging of those parents. How about it? But wait, there's more. Reed tells us, when parents suggested they wanted only therapy treatment, not cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers, doctors treated those parents as if those parents were abusive, uneducated, and willing to harm their own children. These assertions about abuse and suicide were used as tools to stop parents from asking questions and to pressure parents into consenting. The center has a team culture of supporting the affirming parent and maligning the non-affirming parent. Parents routinely said that they felt they were being pressured to consent. Often parents would give consent, but say they were only doing so because, quote, you guys are going to do this anyway, end quote. The center routinely issued puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones without parental consent. Other centers who prescribe cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers require parents to issue written consent. Several times, I asked the doctors to require written consent. They repeatedly refused. The entire time I worked there, the center had no written informed consent and none that was provided to or signed by patients. Brackets, additionally, end brackets, doctors knew that many of our former patients had stopped taking cross-sex hormones and were detransitioning. Doctors did not share this information with parents or children. What do we got going on here? The usual culprits. Greed. The pursuit of the almighty dollar, right? You've got these money-making hounds, these wolves in the medical establishment that are just voraciously gorging themselves on these kids for money at their expense. Why? Oh, we got that BMW, that Acura, that Lexus, that new Tesla. Is it going to pay for itself? What, those mansion with those 6 rooms? How's that going to get paid for? We want 2 pools. We got to have a home theater. We got to live in these guarded neighborhood communities, right? We got to get that $2 million home. How else are we going to get that? You know, but these people, they won't get away with it. I mean, they may get away with it on this plane of existence, but these people will get judged. And it's not going to be pretty. So in chapter 7, we get to learn about Emma. Chapter's called Emma or Oliver. And here's some insight. The author writes, Emma's short life has been filled with adversity. Her mother committed suicide when she was 6, and Emma has not had a positive female role model. A speech defect has led to extreme shyness. She has no siblings or family nearby, and her father works long hours. For Emma, making friends was always a challenge. Most kids just couldn't understand what she said. She was in speech therapy for a few years. In 7th grade, things worsened. Emma was bullied throughout the year. She had made some friends but struggled with her changing body and was not adequately prepared for her period. During lockdowns, Emma isolated in her room. Her real-life social contacts dwindled, and she made a few online friends instead. She was terrified of medical narrative and refused to leave home for days at a time. While Emma had never expressed any problem with being a girl, at the start of 9th grade, she cut her hair and began wearing baggy, androgynous clothing. Her grades fell. When Emma told Chris is her father, she was omnisexual, then transgender, he was stunned. His gut said, no, she's not transgender. There's something else going on. And he contacted me. The author continues, I met Chris to gather a history on Emma and the family. He impressed me as a loving and devoted father who was struggling on his own to raise a daughter with multiple challenges. Emma had been in therapy twice before. After his wife's death and during the bullying at school. He emphasized that he fully supported everything LGBT, and he'd support Emma if she really was lesbian or transgender, but he believed it was premature to make those decisions. I'm going to skip a little bit forward here as the plot thickens. The author writes, she was lonely, sad, and worried. She avoided mirrors, cried frequently, had irritability, poor concentration, and motivation, didn't enjoy anything, and was without much hope that things would improve unless she was able to live as a boy. Emma complained that her father refused to call her the name she'd picked, Oliver, and to use the pronouns he, him. She heard there are parents who refuse to accept their child's gender identity, but she was surprised when she came out to him to discover he was one of them, because he'd always been caring and responsive to her needs. Now she saw him as a bigoted and disrespectful, and their relationship was often hostile. A few times she called him transphobic. So what do we have here? So again, if you're going to go with morality and the straight and true, you've got to commit. Because otherwise, as a parent, and I'm not a parent, but I have an idea of how I would raise my kids, is you have to fully commit to it. Because if you give concessions, you're setting up yourself up for some issues. So the idea that the father was like, hey, if you want to be, I'll support you if you're LGBT or if you really are transgender. Can you? So this man fails to realize that he loves his daughter, but not like this, right? When you start talking about, I have a daughter, but then the daughter is telling me that is really identifying as a boy, but yet you want to support LGBT and transgenderism. So again, it's the untenable dual standard. You can't do both. You can't approve of one form of deviant behavior and then condemn another form of deviant behavior. I mean, what's next? So you're going to support transgenderism but then abhor bestiality? This is what I was talking about earlier. The satanic degradation, the dehumanization, the degeneracy of this de-evolution. So you have to stand your ground and you have to stay committed to the full extent of morality, which is all forms of deviant behavior are deviant because, again, nature has what nature has intended, what God has intended for us as people. This idea of man and woman coming together, ideally under matrimony, having intercourse, and conceiving a child. The main purpose of sex, as nature intended, as God intended. So when you deviate from that and you start saying, oh, no, but this sort of deviant behavior, that's totally okay, yeah, let's do that, you're going to run into problems. And you're going to run into that satanic downward slope as, again, the whole time he's laughing at you as you become less of a human being and you're reduced to this animal. And the government likes it because it's easier to control that way. It's called libido dominandi, sexual liberation and political control on top of it. It's a book written by Dr. E. Michael Jones. I did a book review on that, so check it out. And I also encourage you to check out the other book reviews I did of his work, because those are all relevant here. So I'll conclude with this, from this chapter, this bit. The author writes, with time, I learned that Emma had been molested by an older male cousin and that she'd been exposed to misogynistic pornography. There's the elephant in the room. So earlier, the author had talked about feminism being a big part of this, all kinds of feminism. And how about the role of pornography? So clearly, pornography in the past has been used as a weapon. Israel used it in the 70s against Iran when they hijacked the television stations and they broadcasted hardcore pornography. So we have a history of pornography being used as a weapon. And what does it do? We're going to move on to chapter 8. Here's another part that kind of stood out to me. This is where the author is talking about her experience with having to speak out against what's known as Senate Bill 48. She writes, in 2013, I traveled to Sacramento to testify against Senate Bill 48, legislation mandating, there's that key word again, instruction in, quote, the cultural and racial diversity of our society, end quote. Starting in kindergarten. The bill seemed reasonable. Who doesn't want their child to learn about the contributions of Americans of diverse races? But included in California's list of diversity, it's another big word to pay attention to if you're not already, was transgenderism. The author goes on, in my testimony, I pointed out what was once common sense. Quote, the authors of this bill have ignored the fundamental principles of child development. Children process and integrate information and experiences differently than adults. There are facts that a child cannot easily assimilate because he simply lacks the tools to do so. A child is not a miniature adult, end quote, I reminded the legislators. That's why we have a movie ratings and computer filters. Interesting. That's an interesting thing that you brought up, Dr. Miriam Grossman, because let's talk about movie ratings and what it meant and what happened to them, right? We live in a world where Netflix is hypersexualized with all kinds of content. I mean, just several months ago, they were pushing a show called Cuties, a bunch of kids dancing around and revealing clothing and suggestive themes. I mean, that's bordering on softcore CP, and but again, it's Netflix, and it's just like, oh yeah, there's nothing wrong with it, right? But yeah, of course there is things wrong with it, and it has to do with the undermining of society. This is why these things matter, and so what are we talking about here when she brings this up? We hear about the movie ratings and Hollywood, right? And we all know about Hollywood, right? And its satanic influences and the demons and the that kind of run that show.
Well, because you're part Jewish, right? Part of your family's Jewish?
I'm all Jewish.
You're all Jewish.
100%.
And a lot of Hollywood is Jewish, yeah? It's like a lot of Hollywood is a Jewish business, really. Well, they started Hollywood.
Yeah.
Right. But
I want to bring up what particular event in history radically changed the idea of movie ratings once upon a time in this country. So for that, we're going to time travel to the 50s, and we're going to talk about that at one point in this country, there was something called, which was Catholic, a Legion of Decency, right? At one point, this country had that, right? And they had their say as far as movies, because Hollywood wasn't what it was today, back then, as far as taste and what to show the public, because they had an understanding that to show subversive things or nudity or any kind of sex acts or whatever, that probably isn't in the best interest for society because of its implications. But that changed with one movie, and that movie is called The Pawnbroker. All right, so we're going to go to this website here, and it's by a one Sidney Lumet, right? And we're going to get some information here that there was this production code, right? There was this production code, and that the code, I'm reading from the website, the code has been enforced since 1933 to protect filmmakers from outraged viewers as much as to restrict what they could show on the screen. However, the need to pander to powerful religious and social groups had prompted the PCA to assume an advisory role on screenplay content. They would also excise any scenes that would prevent the awarding of the certificate that passed a film for general exhibition. Aware that the Catholic Legion of Decency had already condemned the pawnbroker, Sherlock withheld PCA clearance both because of the nudity and the bedroom scene involving Jesus and Mabel that was branded, quote, unacceptably sex suggestive and lustful. So what are we talking about here? You have this, he wanted to break this code because he argued that
showing the woman's breast is part of my movie.
Really? Or was there something more going on? And that ever since then, it opened up the gateways to all kinds of degeneracy in film since then. That kept getting incrementally more visceral and more obscene as the times went on. This article, yet by approving the U.S. release in March 1965, the PCA had allowed its defenses to be breached, and there could be no going back. In 1968, the code was replaced by a rating system that ushered in the new Hollywood era, right? And we got guys like, never mind, by allowing filmmakers to explore contentious issues with greater latitude. So now the floodgates are open, and all kinds of degeneracy is able to be put into the American public and to the American consciousness that would undermine their values and tradition and subvert it. And here we are. So chapter 9, this actually stood out for me. The author writes, starts off with a quote, "I don't want to be a woman like my mom," end quote, she told Hank. He and his wife did not accept her boy identity, and Olivia had a tantrum. Hank told her, "You can't become a boy. It's impossible. We must figure all this out." But Olivia became militant. Back at the hospital, the staff were on board with Maddox, and you guessed it, Hank and his wife were in trouble. Dad and stepmom are unsupportive, one psychologist wrote. I got psychology involved, right? They are ultra-Christian and do not accept Maddox as their son. They continue to use his birth name." End quote. The author continues, "Being the straight arrow that he is, Hank told therapist Olivia is a girl and he would always be his daughter no matter what. The issue, he ventured to suggest, wasn't her gender. It was the abandonment by her mother. Why was nobody asking her about that? Why was everyone fixated on names and pronouns?" The author continues, I'm going to fast forward a little bit. "Hank had been fighting to save his daughter from herself. Now he had another battle. Child Protection Services showed up at his door demanding to interview his stepson. Hank refused. Then they discovered he attends a Bible-believing church. It was a big problem for them," Hank told me. "They gave me edicts. They told me I must think about how my beliefs affects others." So this chapter you get some really good insight into the machine, right? And the auxiliary parts of this whole trans agenda machine involving government services and the challenges that parents have to make and they have to endure and overcome as far as these branches of government at the state level and federal level. And that's something. And this book has a wealth of resources as far as what to do in those kind of cases, and that's actually in the pro column for sure, and that's a real thing. So there you go. So we're going to move on to chapter 10. In chapter 10, the author goes into what's in the name, and as you can imagine, naming things is a big deal, right? We name our kids, obviously. We name our pets, and it's important, right? And I'll kind of go into that in a little bit, but the author writes, "Let's start at the beginning. Her name. You probably chose it before she entered this world. You deliberated before picking it, knowing it was a momentous decision. You may have celebrated her naming with family and friends. It was a meaningful rite of passage. And the countless times you repeated it to get his attention, call her to come, comfort her, call her for a meal, inscribe it on a cake. Now she says that name is dead. It's a knife to your heart. Such a simple thing, a name. Such a huge, painful loss. You lost a relationship. Your previously easygoing, compliant, affectionate son became moody, hostile, and distant. You once played music together and Scrabble. Now he seems alien to you. You've lost the lovely connection you once had. The author goes on, parents describe their loss of trust in institutions, the educational and medical systems, the media, their candidates and political parties, feminist organization, the LGBTQ community, their families and friends, and sometimes, sadly, their spouses. Betrayed by all of them. They either pushed the ideology that entrapped their child or went MIA during their dark hours of need. So there's a couple things I want to touch on when it comes to that. So, naming things, right? This is a huge deal, right? And Dr. Jordan Peterson, he does a really good job of articulating this sort of thing in his lecture series on the phenomenology of the divine, in which he illustrates the example of Adam during the book of Genesis, where he starts Adam in the very beginning. He starts naming like the animals and the plants or whatever, because what otherwise is that which does not have a name? It's otherwise in the realm of chaos, in the realm of the undistinguished, right? To name something is to give it an identity, right? To give it a form, to call it into reality, right? So it's a powerful thing, right? And I agree wholeheartedly with the author. Parents, when they name their child, does anybody know of a parent that just is like, oh yeah, willy-nilly, I'm gonna name my daughter Rock? It, 9 times out of 10, probably 10 times out of 10, I would like to think, parents spend a considerable amount of time naming their kid. And so when you, the rebel, think that you're so full of yourself, you're so arrogant, you're so prideful, that you not only do you reject nature and you would say, I was born a girl, but now I'm a man, this nonsense. Not only that, so that's already stunning, because now you're putting that pride over nature, and you're saying, no, I'm gonna do what I want to do, and I'm gonna be what I say I am. And then you add insult to your own parents, and you slap them in the face, and you kick them on the ground, and you say, you know that name that you gave me? You called me Bella. My name is Junkyard Dog. The absolute arrogance to get carried away with this. So chapter 11, we have issues with language again, oriented around language. The chapter is called Euphemisms, and the author writes, as I write this, there are 45,375 girls seeking donations on GoFundMe to pay for what gender surgeons call a masculinized chest, end quote. What the hell is that? I mean, I'm a guy. Do I have a masculinized chest? I mean, I'm working out. I'm trying to get, I digress. Top surgery is a euphemism. Of course, what they're talking about is breast amputation, a bilateral mastectomy. Why the vague, bland language? To normalize the atrocity. Nothing to see here, folks. Just an eighth grader having her healthy breasts sliced off. Just top surgery. So once again, the author's wit is on full display here, and I do applaud her for that. This is deeply atrocious. She nailed it on the head. But, the machine has to change the language. Oh, it's just top surgery. No. Let's call a spade for what it is. You're cutting off healthy body parts of kids. And Jordan Peterson is absolutely right when he calls these kind of people, these greedy people trying to make payments on that mansion or that luxury car, butchers. This next part is also really enlightening as far as making a point about sex education these days. I shudder to think what really goes on. I have some idea. So again, the author is talking about this idea of making it some sort of an educational video about the positivity and the connection between the mother and child during nursing, providing information on how that beautiful act is and how nurturous that is for both of them, physiologically and psychologically. But here, instead, we have this sort of information out there. So the author writes, of course, the miracles of mother-child bonding and the many other wonders of her female biology are utterly foreign to Mia. Her sexuality education focused on her right to engage in oral, anal, and vaginal intercourse, to access contraception and abortions without parental consent, to reject her body and identify as a boy. Pregnancy? Nursing? You've got to be kidding. End quote. So here in chapter 12, this other part stood out to me. This part stood out to me, and here we go. The author writes, Some affirming surgeons are ready and willing to perform whatever fits a patient's fleeting fancy. Phalloplasties, vaginoplasties, bilateral mastectomies, hysterectomies, castration, and, quote, eunuch affirmation surgeries, end quote, or even, quote, genital nullification, end quote, leaving patients with no genitals at all. One affirming surgery clinic's website states, Genital nullification, nullo, or eunuch procedures involve removing all external genitalia to create a smooth transition from the abdomen to the groin. In some cases, this involves shortening the urethra. For patients born with a uterus, a hysterectomy is required prior to any genital nullification procedure. Your specific goals can be discussed with one of our surgeons to develop a plan that works for you. The author writes, that last line means that if you want a penis and a vagina, that's okay too. Just tell us what you want. We create custom-made genitalia. So, in addition to, again, the author's stellar wit, I also want to point out the inherent Faustian pact language that's thinly veiled here. Again, it goes, and I've made this sort of connection in other videos before of mine. It's this idea of the Faustian pact of this devil giving you, here, what do you want? You can have whatever you want. But then it's that same idea, that principle of, be careful what you wish for. Because you may get what you want, but you may find out that what you get that you thought you wanted ends up being much more than you bargained for, and maybe you end up probably regretting it. And that's putting it lightly. But it's this very satanic idea of taking advantage of people, young people, and the misinformed, the fearful, the people who just want to fit in, the people who are vulnerable, left to the wolves, or who are just ready to make a quick dollar and say, yeah, just sign here on the dotted line and
Get you what you want, whatever you want, sure.
But what I really wanted to point out in this chapter was, finally, there's an official mention of God. And it's here at the end of chapter 12 where the author writes, the answer to how do you make a vagina is simple. You don't. The best surgeon in the world can't make a vagina. Only God can make a vagina. And the sooner everyone recognizes the truth, the better. That the author's suggesting that we were created a certain way by a creator, right? None of this is by accident. This idea that people are born gay or are born trans, all of it are lies and have proven to be lies. There's no like gay gene or anything like that. These are things that are pernicious lies, and the people who support them, they don't have a backbone. They will say, oh yeah, that's totally true, because they're too scared or too unwilling to commit to the truth, and because they want to be politically correct, right? They don't want to lose their job or look frowned upon on social media or whatever, and more power to them, but that's weak, honestly. But I'm relieved. I'm relieved to see that the author finally mentions the divine component here in all of this, that nature has a purpose. The way you were created has a purpose. The last part of that is that you have a purpose, right? You are not a mistake. Your life is not by accident. And one more step further, that God has a plan for your life. Overall, though, it is a good book. It was a good read. I would recommend it nonetheless. But I also encourage people to dive deeper into these subjects. I encourage people to read the books of Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control by Dr. E. Michael Jones. Also read The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit by Dr. E. Michael Jones. Read Logos Rising by Dr. E. Michael Jones, and see what you think about that. I think that would help put things in perspective as well. But otherwise, thanks for watching this video, this book review on Lost in Transnation, A Child Psychiatrist's Guide Out of the Madness by Dr. Miriam Grossman. Do recommend it. Let me know your thoughts. If you like this video, definitely give it a like and subscribe to my channel for other book reviews such as this. There's more to come, and I encourage you to check out my other book reviews. I have done extensive book reviews on Dr. E. Michael Jones's work and other relevant book reviews on relevant themes, such as, I think you're really going to like this one on music and morals. And that was written by Basil Cole, and that one was a lot of fun to read, and a good video that I had a lot of fun doing as well. So definitely check it out. Stick around. I encourage you to subscribe. I'm trying to build my channel to keep giving you this content, and thank you again for watching. Peace.